Okay. We're just about ready to get started. Just letting in folks, and here we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mais Saadani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP, the host for today's event, Syria 1 Year into Transition. Yesterday, we marked 1 year since the fall of the brutal Assad regime, which has had a grasp on the country for over 54 years, an anniversary that carries monumental meaning for so many, be it the victims of this regime and the perpetrators enabled by it, those who've lost loved ones, or those who first went out into the streets in 2011 to demand dignity and justice in the face of harrowing levels of brutality. Today, we gather to look at the last year in Syria, understand what's happened on the political, economic, and foreign affairs levels, and to come to terms with the very real challenges that the country is facing in this moment as we look ahead, but perhaps also reflecting on the opportunities before us. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator for the event, my friend and colleague, TIMEP Legal Unit Manager Ubay Kirdali, who is a Syrian lawyer with more than a decade of experience working on Syria, and who also has incredible expertise in international human rights law and comparative work across the MENA region. Ubay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yami. It's been a year since the historic fall of the Assad regime. That unexpected moment shifted Syria's future, and followed by 12 months of intense swing between hope and fear, relief and grief, progress and painful setbacks. Over the past year, Syrians have navigated the complex emotions, memories, and the realities of rebuilding their lives, reimagining their state, and confronting the deep wounds left by decades of conflict, repression, and dictatorship. What has been achieved 1 year into Syria's transition is exactly what we will be discussing today with our guest speakers. From politics and governance to the economy, reconstruction, justice, and the situation of refugees, our guests will walk us through the key developments that have shaped the past year, highlighting practical and constructive recommendations for making the most of the transitional period in Syria. I would like to introduce our great speakers. Their full bios are available on TIMEP's website, as they each bring a rich expertise to this conversation, so I will only share abridged versions of their bios. Sana Mustafa is a movement leader in the forced displacement sector and a feminist human rights activist. After being forcibly displaced by the Assad regime, Sana led the establishment of several global efforts for the representation and inclusion of refugees and forcibly displaced persons. Joseph Daher is a Swiss-Syrian academic and expert on the political economy of the Middle East. He received his PhD in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and his PhD in political science from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Sarah Huneidi is a Syrian writer and civic rights advocate whose work focuses on political transformation, memory, and the lived experiences of Syrians during and after the uprising. And last but not least, Justin Salhani is a non-resident fellow at TIMEP, where his work focuses on misinformation and disinformation in the Levant, and he is also a writer and journalist. Today's conversation is going to be a moderated discussion. We will start with 2 rounds of moderated questions, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. We invite you all to submit questions throughout the discussion, and we will turn to them at that point. Let's get started. I would like to start with you, Sarah. A review of the past year cannot overlook the massacres in the coastal area and Sweden, as well as the related but more limited violations in Ashrafiyat, Sahnaya, and Jaraman. These incidents, among others, represent a dark stain on the country's first year following the fall of the Assad. How would you, from your expertise, assess the transitional government's response to these events? At what measures have been taken? What measures should have been taken, and what can still be done to bring about a Syria for all Syrians going forward?
Thank you, Ubay. It's really unfortunate that, yesterday was the 1 year mark of the fall of the Assad regime, the one that displaced us and killed us and used all measures to suppress us. So for us to find it hard and complicated to celebrate is really, really telling of this year. The transitional government's response to the massacres, has been I'm gonna try to be nice here. It has been insufficient, politicized, and in key moments even complicit. What we have seen is not, a reckoning with mass atrocities from even the Assad's era. We've been too busy dealing with this year's atrocities, which is really unfortunate because we've had a chance and we've given this opportunity to build a Syria for all. So this is a sequence of containment. This is what the government has, the interim government has done. It's done a sequence of containment, narrative management, selective prosecutions, and constitutional/legal moves designed more to legitimize a new governing order while protecting the architecture of coercive power. So I'm gonna lay out, like you asked me, number one, what the government actually did to respond and to legitimate itself. Two, why those actions are inadequate. And in the case of Sueda and state media, for example, actively corrosive. And three, what should have been done and what can still be done to move towards a Syria that protects all of its citizens. So to begin with, what's been done, not just about what happened in Sueda and the massacres. I'm gonna kind of mix it all because they're all like the political actions are actually very connected to the massacres that followed. We've seen, immediate security consolidation and seizure of symbolic sites and of power. We've seen a curated national dialogue that was mostly actually and more like a legitimacy theater, and what do you call it, a box ticking exercise. We've seen Mu'tamar al-Nasr, which is like the victory conference. That's a public ceremony framing of the end of the conflict as a unified victory used to legitimize, the new order. And we've only, seen one color to that conference. We've seen a constitutional declaration that ratified executive power, which is a top-down constitutional declaration. So we've seen domestic fact-finding committees and selective prosecutions after the massacres that occurred. During the massacres, we've seen denial. We've seen the government kind of turn a blind eye to troops traveling from up north of Syria to all the way down south without interference if we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And if we're going to take that benefit of the doubt, we see actually, joining them and abetting them in those attacks. So this is why this response is inadequate and where, it crosses into wrongdoing. First of all, protection failed. In Sweden, the state did more than fail to stop attackers, like I mentioned. We've seen independent observers, UN experts, and investigations have concluded that government forces did not merely fail to protect Jewish communities in Sweden. There are well-documented reports that state aligned forces aided or participated in the assault. They facilitated the movement of armed groups and at times acted in ways that enabled atrocities and actually committed them. That shifts Sweda from communal violence, as they like to describe it, into the domain of state-involved atrocity crimes with attendant legal and moral responsibilities. We've seen state and state-affiliated media amplified sectarian hate speech. We still see it until today. They're even surprised now when someone actually talks in a way that's, Syrian and not sectarian. And we've seen accountability has been more performative and partial. And the national dialogue again was a sham, and the constitutional declaration legalized the fait accompli or whatever. I don't know how to say this, but it's more about also crossing these checkpoints in order to say that we are legitimate, because they know they're not. They know that they arrived and took power. No one elected them, even though they have supporters, but also Bashar al-Assad had supporters. So that doesn't really give you any legitimacy. And what's really concerning to me, other than, of course, the massacres and the personal losses, is the social fabric and Syrian identity are at stake. The combined effect, the incitement, the massacre, the selective accountability, and legitimizing ceremonies has produced, a deepening social fracture. Many Syrians now question whether they are a full member or full members of a single political community or even Syrian. And that existential division is the most dangerous outcome. Once citizenship becomes conditional along sectarian lines, politics becomes more of a permanent security calculus, and the chance for inclusive statehood narrows dramatically. This is very understandable because the way people were killed in those massacres were first asked, "What is your sect?" And if you answer Syrian, that doesn't really save you. You have to answer what your sect is. And if your sect happens to be Druze or Alawite or anything that's unfortunately not Sunni, you're in danger. So your Syrian citizenship kind of means nothing right now. And this is how everything ties in together. You cannot say like these massacres were discrepancies and kind of mistakes and oopsies by the interim government. They are direct results of the policies enacted or the decision to look away when other state actors or non-state actors were attacking other groups in Syria.
Well, thank you so much. It is, what happens beyond even, being unfortunate. It's and also you can see that how even the international community is reacting with these incidents. If I can describe it with like being a dark stain, is the least why can I describe what happened in Sweden and the coastal areas. Justin, you see that over the past year in Syria, Syria demonstrated unprecedented interest in engaging with international community, that including hosting meetings with Arab and foreign delegations, engaging with heads of major states, and maintaining a prominent presence in regional and international conferences. From your expertise, Justin, how would you assess the Syrian government's approach in foreign relations over the past year? And how do you read these developments within the broader geopolitical context in the Levant in general?
Well, thank you for the question, Obey. I think that, the turnaround in Syria in the last year internationally, in terms of its international position, is undoubtedly, shocking, surprising. I think few people thought, especially considering, a government led by Ahmed al-Shara would somehow end up in this position where, you have Trump really, impressed by his looks and making all these sort of statements. The Gulf is completely on his side. Turkey is very supportive. Europe seems to be kind of happy about him. And I think these were surprising things. Of course, I think at the same time, there's two important points here. One is that each of these foreign powers, foreign leaders, are in a position where they're happy about this for their own reasons, right? If we can look at Europe, maybe for the Germans, for the French, and for some of the others, this is because they're ready to send home, refugees on the quote unquote refugee problem. This is a, thing that might be beneficial politically. For the Gulf, this is because they were not on good terms with the Assad regime. And even though there was movements towards normalizations, for example, with the UAE, and I think other leaders were starting to consider it as well, apart from maybe Turkey and Qatar, though as well, Erdogan was, wanted to sit down with Assad, and from what I've heard from various analysts, is essentially the operation on Aleppo was okayed by Turkey because Assad wouldn't sit down with him, and then all the dominoes kind of fell after that. So I think that despite the fact that there have been some positive measures, the fact that sanctions are being removed, the Caesar Act seems to be on the way to be completely repealed, is a phenomenal thing, is definitely important. We need to keep in mind who are going to be the main foreign influences in the country. and what are their agendas there. And I think those agendas don't necessarily align with what's going to be good for Syrian people on the ground. That's true for the Gulf. I mean, it's also true for Israel. Let's speak about Israel for a moment. It makes sense why, despite their aggressions, despite what happened recently in Beijing, the fact that 1 year ago today and yesterday the Israelis were bombing all over Syria. I think few people will blame the Syrian regime, government, army for not trying to engage them in a military action. They're not set up to it. The people are tired of war. They don't want this. So that's understandable. I think at the same time, when you talk about how the Israelis have this impact, for example, how they intervened in Sweden, despite the fact some people on the ground said it had a positive impact at one point in time, I think we can say very clearly, we can speak in recent history, this was not done for the benefit of the Syrian people, right? Like in 2018, I believe it was, there was ISIS attacks in Sweden, and Israel was not getting involved and worried about the Druze at that point in time. Sarah, I see your face. If you disagree with me, please.
No, you're doing great. I can't control my face. Go ahead.
Um, and then if we think about the benefits in terms of the United States and for the Gulf regimes, I think in this case, these are people who have in recent history very much prioritized kind of top-down systems that care much more about economy, security, and economy in ways that benefit themselves, and not necessarily ways that will lead to pluralistic, democratic, systems or means of governance that will be beneficial to the people in the region, right? And if we talk about the wider Levant, that's definitely true. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that one thing this new government has done is really try to gain legitimacy outside and then bring that inside, right? So it's not a sort of bottom-up legitimacy from the people. It's a legitimacy that they're trying to get through the international community. And there needs to be a level of that, obviously, through investment, through, they'll need investment to do reconstruction and things of that nature. But it's, if we take, for example, the issue of the disappeared, this was a thing where for a long time, the government was not meeting with local people. They would meet with international folks before local activists and groups and families. And so a clear pattern has kind of emerged here. And I think that despite the fact, we can say the removal of sanctions is quite possibly a miracle, because speaking to a lot of analysts, especially, American analysts in the early days after the fall of the regime, they were saying, chances are next to zero. No way this happens. The future is really dark, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an incredible thing that's happened. I don't think, like I mentioned, I think this is a thing that happened because other places have interests in this happening more so than just this government has pulled off some, miracle thing themselves. And so I think that going forward, it's deeply important that, people with a voice inside Syria, in the diaspora and beyond, are able to push this through. That despite the fact that, I was in Damascus yesterday and speaking to people in and around Umayyad Square. Obviously you're getting a certain type of person there, but they're quite happy and they praise the government very much. But at the same time, I think it's important to know that, what we see taking shape seems very much to be similar to maybe other governments in the region that are not pluralistic, that are not democratic, and that are honestly quite concerning for the region and for the Syrian people going forward, especially those who don't necessarily feel represented by the government. I remember, last thing I'll say is that I remember I was in Damascus on December 9th last year. So I went in the day after the regime fell. There were no checkpoints at that time. And we got in and we kind of bounced around in the day and tried to talk to as many people as we possibly could across the city in different parts. And I went back 3 times in December. I went to Aleppo. And then I went back in February and I made it to Sueda, actually. I made it to Aleppo. I made it to Hama. And, speaking to people in different places, at that time, it seemed to be that a lot of people, very few people were unhappy about the fall of the regime at that time. And many people were willing to kind of give a chance, were hopeful that, the future would be different. This last time that I went back, it felt to me as though, and though my experience was short and it was in one city this time, it felt to me as though that kind of good faith had shifted, and that it now was very much falling a lot more along identity lines. And so, the last thing I'll say there is that if for Syria to have a foreign policy and international relations that are important, the hope going forward is that they take into account what the Syrian people want and need, across the entirety of, what is historically the Syrian country and its borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. And it's quite important also to read this within this broader sort of dynamics, because also it has some influence on the country's economic decisions as well, and relationships with the states. And this is exactly what I would like to ask you, Joseph, about. You see that in the past year we saw promises from the Syrian government to increase salaries, to improve the economic situation, and we also saw the signing of MOUs of billions of dollars with foreign companies to implement mega projects involving long commitments in Syria. At the same time, and also that can relate to what Justin mentioned, like Syrians report only minimal improvement on their daily lives, while others also describe the current economic situation as worsening, with prices remaining extremely high, electricity fees doubling, and access to basic needs such as housing, food, and livelihoods continuing to be a major challenge in Syria for Syrians. How would you assess the current economic approach being adopted by the transitional government in a country devastated by years of armed conflict and systematic corruption? And in your view, Joseph, what should the government be doing on the international and domestic levels to address the challenges it faces?
Thank you, Bay. Thank you for organizing this panel, and I'm very happy and honored to be sitting with all of you, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion, which I'm quite sure. Regarding the economic approach, I think it's in complete continuity with what Justin was mentioning before. First of all, I think it's important to see that the first objective of this government or this new ruling strata has been to gain international legitimacy and not legitimacy from below. As Sarah was explaining very well, it's been more of a theater since day one. And the first objective has been consolidating power. And the first element to it was the international legitimacy. And rooting Syria in a new geopolitical alliance in which the US is leading it, and with the Gulf monarchies and Turkey, and in which a normalization with Israel is potentially envisaged. And this is also done in a particular economic approach to attract foreign direct investment coming from Gulf monarchies, from Turkey, potentially the US, but it was made also in a way to break Syria's isolation. And in this perspective, we can acknowledge the fact that Syria has been completely, or the new ruling team has been successful. And the most symbolic evolution to this has been the welcoming of Ahmed al-Shara to the White House, and the fact that Syria is back in most of the international organization, including monetary institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, etc. So in terms of breaking Syria's isolation, not only politically, but economically, it has been a success, as well as regarding the removal of sanctions. Obviously, this has been made in concessions to further concessions, which would be that Syria will be most probably in this new geopolitical alliance and serving interest of the US, Gulf monarchies, and potential normalization with Israel. So as a first thing to say is that they've been quite successful in breaking Syria's isolation. And we also have to acknowledge that any kind of political actor succeeding Bashar al-Assad after 14 years of war, 15 years of dictatorship, would have faced humongous challenges, and especially in economic terms, when we see physical destructions cost of reconstruction being between 120 billions to 350 billions. In terms of economic loss in total for the past 14 years is 1,000 billion, a third of a trillion, etc. This said, I think that, and obviously people could say it's a bit of a short term to analyze the pillars of this economy or this approach that you were saying, 1 year. But I think the main problem is not the time setting, it's about the pillars that are being built. And all the pillars for me are going into the wrong direction. Meaning that, for example, we've seen an economic approach that is basically serving a small minority. While this government claims very much in a sectarian dynamics to present the far majority of the Arab Sunnis, actually most of the population, and including their popular base, is suffering from the economic policies. And despite the fact that they've been, seeing major, you were mentioning, memorandum of understanding, which have a series of problems. First of all, we don't know how the selection criteria has been made. Why these companies and not others? We don't know about the content, which will have effect also the sovereignty of the state regarding especially electricity. But moreover, they need to be implemented because although in the first 6 months of the year we have promises of investment of 25 billions over, we still need to see them implemented. Secondly, most of the policies are benefiting a small minority. How? For example, when we see willingness of privatization of state enterprise, austerity measures, harming the most wider section of the population. When you see the price of bread that passing from 1,000 Syrian pound to 4,000 Syrian pound, while the quantity diminished. End of oil derivatives, which has not only an effect on the population, but also on the productive sectors of the economy. Agriculture and industry that has been suffering massively of the policies of this government that cannot even sustain because there's no protection from foreign products. Also, there's a form of trade liberalization that has been advanced. Finally, the price of electricity that is also affecting both the population and the economy as a whole. And it's more than double. We're talking about 3,000 to 6,000% of increase, even more than a particular rent. So today, most of the Syrians are not living out of their salaries, despite the fact that the government has increased by 200%. But the fact to increase while you remove all the subsidies doesn't have any kind of qualitative effect. Today, the minimum salary is $70. Someone, a middle cadre in the public sector, 150, private sector 200. But the cost of living for a family of 5 in Damascus is minimum $700 minimum. This is without, so most of the Syrians are living out of remittances by the Syrian people that are much more important than international humanitarian assistance. We're talking about 4 to 6 billions. So this is why I'm saying that the pillars of this government is basically serving a small minority, typical neoliberal policies in which you're seeking short-term profit investment, but not investments that will benefit the majority. Do Syrian people need today big malls to be built? Do they need real estate, luxurious real estate? And we come back to this in reconstruction that is very problematic, not at all targeting the reconstruction for the vast majority of the Syrian population. Boosting trade. Moreover, we're actually seeing concentration of economic power in new networks of businessmen and in the presidential palace. So contrary to what Syrian officials have been saying, rather than a rupture with the past, what we're seeing is continuity in terms of dynamics. Neoliberal dynamics, focusing on trade, finance, non-productive sectors of the economy, while we have new forms of crony capitalism. So this is why actually the pillars are wrong. And what we should be seeking is to serve the 99% of the population, basically control price production, seeking salaries to be indexed on inflation, supporting small and medium enterprise that constitute 95% of the enterprise. Moreover, there's a new fiscal tax system being put forward in Syria that will benefit big companies and individuals with large profit, which is a flat tax, corporate tax. This is what I'm saying, especially in a post-conflict situation, what we're witnessing is the opposite of any form of economic recovery and development process that should be put in place.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for highlighting these critical issues, but also the way forward if we want to bring about a change in the economic situation of the country. Sana, you know that two national committees were established last year on the transitional justice and missing persons. And the work of each faces significant hurdles and challenges due to the massive responsibilities they each bear. However, some skepticism exists regarding the state's genuine intent to properly address these two key issues. As a daughter of a missing father and an advocate for survivors' rights, how do you assess the efforts made by these national committees since their establishment? And in your view, Sana, what measures should be taken to achieve the most meaningful outcomes for victims and survivors in Syria?
Thank you, Ray. And yeah, it's great to come after what everyone has shared. And thanks for those who joined us here. I really it's really, really hard to try to find the positive things in the past year, right? And that's, I think, what we really, I think, in preparation for everyone to know, in preparation for this panel, like we really were trying to be not just focusing on the problem, but identifying solutions. But the realities of the past year have made it really hard. And I think the file, or the issue of the disappeared, is also another example that I really hate to be like killjoy, but no major efforts or significant efforts have been taken towards that. So as you mentioned, there has been two committees that have been commissions that have been formed to look into the disappeared in Syria. The main issue with I would say outside of that, the other efforts, to first maybe name the efforts that have been done, outside of the creation of these committees by the president, by Ahmed al-Sharia, and there recently have been some memorandum of understanding in partnership with another international commissions and committees and organizations to work with these national committees to look into this the file and the process of it. So we have partnerships that have been recently signed, and we have the creation of a body that's mandated to look into that. The issue, I think, is not in the what has been done per se, is also like the details of this work and what has not been done. And one of the major things around the disappeared and the detainees issue, and how can you talk about that without talking about also accountability and war crimes in Syria, is that evidence has been really erased in a way. Some of it purposefully, and some of it the lack of prioritization. So the reality is that in the past year, since the fall of the Assad regime, at the beginning, detention centers and torture facilities were public parks. Were open to public, and everyone was in and out, and they were not at all preserved, and that led into lots of damage of evidence, and a lot was stolen, which I think in the last week we've heard about new files, which we don't know how much of that was stolen versus was actually came forward through other preserved mechanisms. But we know that the crime scenes were not protected, and they kind of continue not to be. And I think one of the facts that I still can't believe how it's just like passed in the last year, I guess, when you think about the massacres as well in Sweden and the coast. So a lot will just, people cannot keep up with everything. But one of the things that we mentioned that we faced when we are looking of my father is that the new government has painted over the walls of many of these detention centers that literally these are like evidence and war crime scenes. And these are not just for symbolic and sentimental importance, but actually these are answers for many of the families. And so my family got an answer that my father existed in this branch 215 from July 3rd to July 8th. Like, this is an answer we've been looking for 12 years. And no other way we could have found it, and we couldn't find it, except literally from what he left for us on the wall, his writing on the wall. And I think like this has to like sit with it and let it sink to understand that what does it mean for a regime of 60 plus years. And since the beginning, there has been disappeared persons and detainees who wrote their names and documented their existence on these walls. And these walls were painted over. It really, I mean, no matter what the reason, people are like, why? We don't care. I truly don't care. And there's no reason on earth that could convince anyone that works in international human rights or in the families or the survivors of why such a behavior would be done. And it was done. And it really did not take the public media that should have been taken, that they have not been held accountable for it. And for those who really like dying to know like why, when we asked why, we heard that they needed to utilize these spaces for other use. The country has no spaces to be used. And so it really, it's so hard to, I mean, politically and from lived experience and proximity to the issue, it's so hard to believe in genuine efforts and efforts that are neutral and efforts that are really centering the families, the survivors, and the victims while we see such behaviors. And so as much as a lot of our unfortunate, likely, people who revolted with us kind of are unhappy with how much we're trying to, point these issues, as much as I genuinely want to believe in a process that's carried on right now by the transitional government, I don't want to oppose more. I would love to support. But by the way, for everyone, we are exhausted by opposing, and we would love to actually acknowledge and be like, yes, they are doing something significant, but it has not been done. And so no evidence and destroying of evidence and no preservation of evidence and stealing of evidence, and that current committees, and the other thing is that is really unclear who crimes they're looking at and disappeared by who, right? Like what we know is that mainly by the Assad regime. It's not justice for those who've been disappeared by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and by ISIS and by other groups. And these are all past, not talking about the disappeared in this year. And so it's really, what's the way forward? Yes, we are not, maybe another note here, we're not really, it's not rocket science because it has been done in many other contexts. We're not the first in Syria to experience that. And I think this is very important for us as Syrians to remember. I know we have nuances to our situation in our country and our demographics and all of it, but we're not the first to experience, especially the issue on transitional justice and the disappeared. So many other contexts have experienced. There has been, I don't need actually to even share how many papers have been submitted by local, Syrian, and international and multi-governmental bodies proposing very technical steps and processes around how to do this better. I think the bottom line here, there's no political will.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sana, for the amazing intervention. I think that definitely no future for Syria without justice and bringing the rights of those survivors and impacted. Thank you so much for putting also and highlighting your personal experience in that. That's really appreciated. Joseph, I will get back to you, starting from the point you've mentioned in your intervention. You've said like the thing about the reconstruction. You know that last October, the World Bank estimated Syria's reconstruction cost at $216 billion after more than 13 years of conflict, which is insane. Where can these resources realistically come from? And how should the government assess and determine reconstruction priorities? And how the government should place the victims' and survivors' rights at the center of reconstruction planning and implementation?
No, we cannot deny, by once again, I think it's humongous challenges. But I think what Sana was saying is interesting about comparative experiences, because very often, even among Syrians, we think it's exceptional Syria. Unfortunately, in this world, and especially in the Middle East, it's not exceptional. We have various cases of post-conflict countries that have went through so-called reconstruction, but actually no reconstruction, actually. And then when we talk about reconstruction, it's about not repeating the mistakes of the past and entrenching underdevelopment dynamics. And we have two cases that are interesting to look at, is Lebanon and Iraq. In both cases, the post-reconstruction period actually deepened the problems that these economies had in the past and did not have any kind of reconstruction, increased corruption, lack of governance, lack of transparency, and lack of democracy per se. Democratic dynamics from below, what I mean. And in this perspective, looking at Syria, what could be the fiscal resources? No one deny here again that Syria needs international humanitarian assistance, international development assistance, just as Syria needs foreign direct investment. It needs foreign investment. But the issue is, where does this money should go? And this money should not go into, kind of the project I was describing before, luxurious commercial sites, trade dynamics, finance, or etc. It should go to sectors of the economy that have the ability to provide jobs, to provide national production, which is manufacturing industry and agriculture. Secondly, it would be local resources. Yes, Syria, 90% of the population live under the poverty line, indeed, but you do have people that have money and should pay accordingly to their revenues and profits. So this is why I'm coming back to the progressive fiscal taxation. It's not normal that a company having over 200 employees and one that has 5 employees would pay the same corporate tax. This is fundamentally unjust. Similarly, the approach of the government to say basically we will have donations made by businessmen from 1 billion here, 1 billion there to help for the reconstruction is fundamentally unjust. Plus here, I think it's important to speak also about transitional justice, because yes, indeed, it's about human rights violation, but it's also about economic rights. And therefore, the money that have been donated by people like Hamsho is unacceptable. This money should go back to the state of Syria. He shouldn't be allowed to donate a million. No, his wealth is part of the Syrian people, and his economic crimes should be tackled very much. So here also we have this aspect that should be tackled to bring for the reconstruction. Similarly, when it comes to reconstruction, it should be inclusive. The problem is the political transition has not been inclusive. And reconstruction, same. So priorities are not for the 99%. We actually saw protests in Homs or in places like Marota to oppose luxurious real estate schemes, while the popular neighborhood that has been destroyed have not been the target of reconstruction. Same for Marota. So I think here reconstruction needs to be much more inclusive, to include trade unions, professional associations, local associations, to target, as you were saying, the most important victims. And therefore, reconstruction, just as the political transition, should be inclusive and democratic. Otherwise, we will have a reconstruction that is not a reconstruction, that will repeat the same mistakes of the past and deepen underdevelopment in the absence of an inclusive process.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for this amazing intervention, and also that could be linked, like what you're saying, to all of the related political and governance steps taken by the government. Some of them that mentioned by you, and also others being mentioned earlier by Sarah. So Sarah, we'll get back to you on these points so you can expand a little bit about the broader political and governance related matters. You know that since the fall of the Assad regime, many things or many steps been taken on that regard. While some people view these efforts as the best as the transitional government could realistically achieve in its first year, given the deeply entrenched legacy of the Assad regime and the severely deteriorated condition of the state, while others also look at them as little more than box-ticking exercise to satisfy the international pressure, and while potentially also consolidating a new authoritarian power in Syria. So from your view, Sarah, how would you assess the political and governance-related efforts of the transitional government over the past year in Syria? And what do you assess as positive, and what would you say should have been done differently, and how on that regard? Thank you.
Yeah. Syria's gonna, I swear, it's gonna bring the death of me, or like the end of me, because of how much I see potential and how much I see it wasted. Part of my the way I coped with exile the last 10 years is to try to study how other countries actually tried to rebuild. So in Arabic I've been saying, عم غني بالطاحون صار لي سنة هيك حاسة. يعني it's more like you're singing in a mill, no one is listening to you. It's actually the opposite is happening, but I'm gonna try to be very, very objective here and give you that assessment, and please bear with me because it's going to be a little bit long. So I think the transitional government's political and governance record over the past year reflected to me what seemed to be managed political opening without meaningful redistribution of power. Some steps were unavoidable and technically necessary for state survival, but taking as a whole, the sequence of actions, they created, as we mentioned, created political dialogue, symbolic conferences, executive first cabinet formation, and a top-down constitutional declaration. This is very alarming. It fits a classic pattern of authoritarian transition engineering, not democratic transition, authoritarian, because, in short, this has been a legitimacy project more than a democratization project. And as much as, Sana mentioned, like our comrades of the revolution are tired and they really want to see the goodness in this project, but it's unfortunately we don't have the luxury to look at it that way because reality speaks differently. So the pattern is not unique to Syria. It is well documented in post-conflict and post-authoritarian transitions where security elites consolidate first, constitutionalize second, and they democratize really never, or maybe much later. So what can legitimately be assessed as positive? Three things can be acknowledged as technically constructive, even if, politically insufficient. We've seen basic state continuity and, let's say, collapse prevention. They're doing horrible, by the way, but still, it's not collapsed. So kudos for that. So we've seen reopening ministries, restoring baseline service delivery, creating a centralized fiscal authority. This all prevented immediate institutional collapse. This is kind of, avoided the Somalia-style fragmentation. But again, this aligns with global post-conflict stabilization literature, but it is not democratic progress. It is mostly administrative triage, let's say. We've seen also reopening of civic space compared to Assad-era total closure. We deserve much better, by the way. We cannot keep comparing to Assad-era silencing and complete silencing, basically, because we did not pay all of this during the revolution to be a little bit better than Assad, because anything really will be a little bit better than Assad, but it's still not enough. So we've seen limited political speech, partial media activity, civil society re-registration, that's a relative opening after decades of total political suffocation. But comparative evidence is also very clear. Early civic opening without security reform is reversible and often co-opted. Also, we've seen re-engagement with international institutions. We've seen re-entry into UN channels, humanitarian coordination, sanctions negotiations, all of this reduced isolation and economic freefall. But from a government lens, however, external legitimacy has outpaced internal legitimacy, which is structurally dangerous in transitions. And where the transition has fundamentally failed, in my opinion, is like I said, the national dialogue was structurally non-democratic, a process that is more about executive controlled, non-elective, non-binding, and without independent safeguards cannot be described as democratic participation. And let's not forget that, when the Syrian people revolted in 2011, not because they wanted better economy, not because they wanted the electricity to be on most of the time, they revolted because they wanted freedom, they wanted democracy, they wanted dignity. So again, this is not met, and political science is unequivocal here. Consultation without power transfer is not participation. It's like we've shown it's a legitimation theater. So the Constitutional Declaration ratified power instead of founding it. We've had a really amazing chance to build foundations of a democratic not complete building it, because a lot of people are telling me to be realistic and it's only been 1 year and give them a chance, but set the foundations for democracy. So issuing a constitutional framework after executive consolidation reverses the democratic sequence. So instead of going from people to constitution to government, it became government to constitution to people later, maybe. This is a textbook case of executive constitutionalism and not a constituent democracy. And we've seen many comparative warnings, around the world. We've also seen security sector reform that was, postponed instead of front-loaded. This is really important because it is costing us Syrian lives. No democratic transition succeeded when armed actors remain autonomous and vetting is delayed and civilian oversight is absent. And we're seeing even the protection of war criminals under the name of Silm al-Ahli or like civic peace or whatever you want to call it, because they are negotiating with them and giving us information, etc. But every major study agrees that delayed SSR basically is the single strongest predictor of authoritarian collapse. And we also see transitional justice was subordinated to political convenience. There is still no independent national truth commissions, no binding accountability framework, no unified reparations law, no systemic prosecution of Syrian perpetrators. We're seeing like very kind of not really organized or a framework or any plan for transitional justice. So this locks Syria into what scholars call stability built on unresolved crimes. You want stability. Again, this is not what we revolted for. We had stability. This is not the goal. This is a structure that reliably collapses later. It's not built on real justice. And as my colleagues here already discussed, political economy was never democratized. It all, remains the reconstruction pathway remains opaque. We don't see transparent property and restitution, competitive market access. We're seeing actually the foundations of a liberal kind of market, but it's not really based on real access to everyone. And we don't see also anti-corruption courts. So this way you get a new oligarchy, not a republic. And we have comparative warnings from next to us, Iraq, Lebanon, and even post-Soviet states. So what should have been done differently is the undoing of all this stuff, but really structurally, not cosmetically. So there's I'm not being idealistic. It's not idealistic demands. There are minimum conditions drawn from every successful transition since the 1970s. So we need to see security sector reform first, not last. Immediate vetting, unified civilian command. This has been, I don't know actually if it can be saved at this point, but let's just go back to scholarship and forget what is real and what is not. We need suspension of implicated commanders. We need international monitoring, not just, word of mouth to the United States. It doesn't work this way. And we also need a real constituent process before a constitutional declaration. We need elected constituent body, not chosen by anyone. We need diaspora representation. A lot of people still couldn't come back, and instead of being treated like fulul or like these people who couldn't come back, they were actually called fulul, and they actually the government official who called people remnants of the regime apologized. So let's move on. We need to see victims' participation, victims from the more than 130,000 people who are disappeared, victims of displacement, victims of torture. We don't see participation, and we don't even see participation by the Free Syrian Army, by the way. It's only one faction that's actually in control right now and a couple other factions. And we don't see a binding public referendum. And we should have independent transitional justice architecture. We need to see hybrid courts or even internationalized prosecutions. No country should be able to do this alone. We need to learn from other contexts, and we really desperately need national truth commissions, especially among communities that are diverse in sect across sect lines. And we need to see reparations and restitution law. And now sometimes they're trying to focus or fix some of the things or kind of cover on the massacres that happened this year, and people who have endured massacres in the last 40 years. They're saying, what about us? People in the in tents are saying, "What about us?" So this kind of sporadic, no pathway, no clear lines of justice is causing a lot of harm. And again, we need decentralized governance and real power sharing. Elected local councils with fiscal authority, they keep saying it's not possible. It is possible. I mean, we need minority protection baked into law. We need limits on executive appointments to power. And I was thinking yesterday when I was trying to answer this question, like, I don't even know if real democracy and power sharing are possible at this point. But this is not despair, because I'm always being told like I'm being despair. This is empirical realism. Look at everything that I've just listed for you. Every transition that postpones justice, centralizes coercive power, performs dialogue without redistributing authority, and constitutionalizes executive dominance produces two things: either direct authoritarian restoration or hybrid authoritarian with elections but no accountability. So this is take this
Well,
take it in. It's not idealism.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And we'll take it immediately from that point to Sana, because also what you've mentioned might impact in a way or another the return of refugees. Sana, the return of Syrian refugees has become the top priority for host countries, as you know, and new asylum policies are making it increasingly difficult to process and approve new asylum applications coming from Syria, particularly in Europe, while also increasing insecurity for those who continue to live under their temporary protection status. So in the current context, how would you describe, Sana, the actions and policies of host countries? What should host countries be doing instead? What truly voluntary, safe, and dignified return for Syrian refugees actually look like?
Yeah, thank you, Ubay. So on the returning question, so I mean, just like some numbers, the estimated numbers is around 3 million Syrians have returned, but to be clear, 1.2 from our refugees who basically crossed the border, so returning from neighboring countries or Europe, and the rest, the majority, which like the 1.7 or 6 are IDPs, who are internally displaced persons who returned to their original areas. And so the focus here is really more about like the 1.2 who's returned from Europe and neighboring countries. And the question of return is actually, there are many angles to consider and to think about. First is that a lot of those who returned, especially from neighboring countries, have returned. I mean, usually people return also like not because they miss home and it's great, but also because the situation got way worse on in these neighboring countries. We have witnessed like a huge humanitarian aid cut, and which affected people's ability to stay in camps and the services they received in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, for example. Like these countries have, you know, the aid has been reduced a lot, which affected the quality of life. And so and that's something to consider of also like why people would return. The other reason, obviously, or the other reality that in terms of the regulations in the EU is that the EU is still kind of trying to determine how they're going to deal with this on Syria. So I think just on December 3rd, there has been a new guidelines by the EU released around asylums for Syrians, saying basically those who are seeking asylum based on the ground of the Assad regime and its military forces, this is no longer a ground for asylum in Europe. And then kind of more on the question of the current moment, a lot of them, including Germany, still trying to determine how they're going to deal with the existing asylum cases and ongoing and new ones. So Germany, for example, and have put on hold all processing of asylum applications for Syrians, whether they are, you know, before the fall of the regime or in the upcoming year. I think the bottom line here is that obviously, like the priority should be to respect the international law, non-refoulement, and to also respect people's choice to return. And I think the question on return was also just from a human perspective is interesting because there is an assumption, which is not saying it's not true, but it's also not necessarily shouldn't be generalized, that people want to return. Some people have started completely new lives, somewhere else, and they don't want to return, and that's okay. And I think it's about the choice, right? It's about having the legal right. It is a human and legal right. And so many were born, for example, like we have new generations that born abroad and born in camps, or born in Western countries. And so I think the question of return should be completely voluntary. And I think that's exactly the emphasis here, is that how do we make sure that European countries, northern countries, and neighboring countries continue to respect the international law around the legal rights for people to claim asylum, and then the right to stay if they decide to stay, and then to return. People, there are many considerations for return. One of them, and the major one, is security and the safety in the country. And Syria in this past year has not been secure and safe, and that's something, at least we can say, not for everyone, right? And if anything, we have a lot of new refugees, the Alawites, that have fled to Lebanon this year. So actually we have a new wave of refugees that's fleeing a new type of atrocities, that also, it's unclear how it's going to be dealt with. But the fact of the matter is that I think we have to advocate and make it clear for those who are making new regulations around asylum, is that the country is not safe for everyone. And that's a very important fact. And actually, regardless where you stand and sit and you belong to in terms of sect and political affiliations, the country physically, geographically, is not safe. There's so many unexploited weapons that, around 570 people died just in this year in Syria from unexploited weapons. And people don't have homes. And, Joseph has been talking about the economic situations. People don't have homes, destroyed or taken over. People don't have their property documents and property rights and civic documentation, which is a very important issue that the Syrian government needs to have a very clear process and structure toward those who are returning without their documentation. And so that's another important issue. And the life expense is just huge. And at least in the camps, or in neighboring countries, or in Europe, you receive some government support. Like Joseph talked about the economic reality, and this is not an intellectual take, this is a real take. There's not a single Syrian family not living on the money that comes from abroad. And I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of the refugees in Europe send the money they receive from the governments there to the job centers and social security to their families in Syria. They send some of it to the families in Syria to actually live, because otherwise you can't live. And so I think, again, what's important about the question of return is for us as Syrians, and for those who work on these issues, to ensure that it continues to be voluntary, dignified, that the circumstances in the country are actually allowing for return. And the bottom line is that all of this should be really under international law with respect to refugee rights.
Thank you so much, Sana. And also would like to get to you, Justin, on couple of the points that you've touched upon in your first intervention, but also there's an overlapping question. We got it from the audience. So you as you've mentioned, there is, a spread of misinformation and disinformation in Syria right now, and there's in a quick scroll through the social media, you can see this surge of misinformation. There are conflicting narratives spreading across the society and threatening what remains of the social cohesion and stability. And while that is, understandable, maybe different narratives is something natural and healthy, but how can these conflicting narratives be managed constructively in a way that respect differences, build trust, maintain social cohesion in a country after years of mistrust, atrocities, and repression? What is the role of the transitional government in that? So how can you describe that? What forms of misinformation, disinformation patterns have you managed to see either on social media or throughout your visits to Syria? What sort of communications you had there?
That's a very deep and layered and textured question. I think, as you mentioned, when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, um, a lot of it comes through narratives. And obviously, what we've seen in the last year is that this disinformation and misinformation has become deadly on a number of occasions. It's led to widespread violence, provocations. We can talk about the coast, we can talk about Sueda, we can talk about recently in Homs, which luckily didn't get to the same levels as elsewhere. I think we can even start with yesterday. December 8th is obviously many things to many different people. Some people didn't celebrate. I think a lot of people did celebrate, but then there's a question of what are you celebrating, right? Were you celebrating the fall of the Assad regime, or are you celebrating, the fact that, a government that you like the look of is in power? And I think the government itself was probably trying to push the latter, in Damascus, on the road to Damascus and in Damascus the last few days, a lot of the billboards show a sense of militarization. Like you have gunmen on the billboards, so it's kind of this idea of showing reverence towards the army, towards the military, towards the security forces. Those are decisions that are intentional, right? In terms of social cohesion, one thing this government needs to do, or any government needs to do, is build trust. And in order to do that, let's talk about narrative for a moment, because as you mentioned, there are different narratives, and sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, we need a unified narrative, or we need a cohesive narrative. And I think that historically in many different places, I'm Lebanese, I live in Lebanon, different people have different narratives, right? They're going to have different narratives. Now, the state can have their narrative. It doesn't mean everyone's going to believe it or buy it, because people have their own lived experiences, and your lived experiences shapes your narrative. How you interpret and respond to an action is how you will interpret that narrative. What needs to be done and what the government can do is try to build trust through acts of not provoking or leading to provocations, whether they're sectarian or otherwise, doing everything they can to provide a level of security and stability, essentially do all the things that Sarah and Sana and Joseph have talked about over the last hours, to build a bottom-up approach, to make people feel, have economic rights, to feel safety and security across the country. So, it's not about developing one narrative, because the government does have a pretty solid narrative at this point in time. But the thing is, it's a narrative that only a percentage of the country can buy into. One thing we've seen a lot of is that people who were opposed to the regime for a long time were maybe working in different sectors of human rights or media or other things like that, since the fall, have completely thrown their hats into the ring supporting the government. There's a lot of people, and I won't name names, and I know, listen, a lot of young Syrians, and maybe not so young Syrians, picked up cameras, started covering the revolution, the uprising, and then later on, armed events. And so there's not necessarily training, there's not necessarily a journalist education, and a lot of them did incredible work, work that was putting their lives in danger, and showing, despite how indifferent so much of the world was to what happened in Syria, was just incredibly important. Now I see some of these same people, doing what maybe we would call PR or government, spreading government narratives. They're just kind of covering government meetings, covering, international visits, rather than taking a critical eye to what is happening. And I think that's troubling. So that narrative is there, it's present, right? If the government puts out that narrative, that's not going to change how people who don't trust them are going to feel about them. So essentially what we need to live in a society is not a unified narrative. We can have different narratives. We can interpret things in different ways. What we need is, a functioning state that essentially provides us with our rights, that allows us to coexist, and allows us to, feel safe and secure, that prevents the widespread reaction of violence. And essentially, does things so that, you know, not just going over the past, but in terms of going forward in the future, because we're all going to interpret the past in our different ways. It needs to make sure that the information it's spreading is factual. It needs to, you know, these things are all important. But it, you know, so obviously having a commitment to truth and reconciliation and fact and justice, all those things are incredibly important to prevent societal breakdown. Because essentially when these, you know, and you know, when we can talk about some of the things that might have fueled beyond sectarianism, beyond provocation from the government at times, or forces aligned to the government that led to widespread violence. There was also, you know, what many people have told me in these situations is that there were incidents where some of these aggressors were taking what they felt was justice into their own hands, right? And now if the state is playing that role and is actually holding people accountable for the crimes over the last, you know, let's say not just 14, but going back to the beginning of the Assad regime, of Hafez al-Assad and before, if they're holding all these people accountable, and there is a sense of justice moving forward, and then there is that trust where you know that if somebody acts out against somebody else in a manner that is against the framework of the law, there will be no need to take these sort of incidents into your own hands. There'll be no sort of need to decide to enact violence on someone else. So I think when we talk about narratives, multiple narratives existing side by side is okay, but there needs to be a sort of wider trust, and that comes through, you know, accountability. And then in terms of misinformation and disinformation going forward, this is going to be one of the, I think, you know, most difficult things to tackle, especially in a state where, like with Syria, you know, the media infrastructure is not as developed as it is in some of its neighboring countries, you know, because for such a long time there was absolutely no free media. There was only state media. Of course, there were a number of amazing initiatives that were happening in the diaspora and outside, or secretly, that have just done phenomenal work. But it needs time for that infrastructure to grow and that ecosystem to flesh out. And we're also entering an era where, you know, AI is reaching certain levels, and that spread of AI will, one, give bad faith actors a means of, or a method to be able to instigate and be provocative towards new means of violence or other incidents, as well as, you know, people who, for example, might catch something on video that real happened, have an excuse to just give it away. So it will, you know, lead to sort of, it has the potential to lead to sort of, you know, wider fractions and splits. So for these sort of incidents to not have the kind of power to divide, there needs to be, you know, essentially all, you know, as Sarah and Sana and Joseph spoke about, you need to have, you know, these important pillars for the state.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Justin. We'll now get to as much as I can from the Q&A. There are many questions. So I hope I can cover as much as possible. Sana, there are several questions regarding the transitional justice and the lack of political will. Can you, in short, like in 2 minutes, describe to us or to explain the lack of this political will on transitional justice? How do you explain that, and how to change that? What sort of pressure could be used, if any, possibilities to do that in order to move forward with transitional justice process that is center the rights of victims?
Yeah, I mean, the lack of political will, I mean, it comes from the background of this government. I mean, it's really like, that's kind of the short answer. I mean, this government is, or many of the people in the current government and everyone is implicit in actually many war crimes in the past 12, 13 years in Syria by being affiliated with other groups. And so, you know, by prioritizing transitional justice accountability for war crimes, they're implying themselves too. And so it's really that basic as well. Is like, you know, it's like, yeah, we can analyze political will a lot, but there's this reality about the DNA and nature of the leaders of this government, that yes, how would I have the will to actually neutrally and with accordance with international law, and leveraging a lot of the expertise that I have locally and international context to prioritize this if it's going to imply me and my people, and we are holding power right now. And so it's conflict of interest in a way. And so that's like one of the reasons. I mean, the other thing, like there's a lot of narratives around, well, they don't have the expertise, and like they just got in, give them time. I mean, no one is asking first, when it's a government, right? So there are ministries and there are people who do different things. So we're not saying like, first you chose to be the transitional government. So actually that is your responsibility. And there are many ministries to do that, to do that job. The second thing is that we're not saying do it alone. Actually, you shouldn't be doing it alone. From like impact and ethical and effectiveness and efficiency, it shouldn't be done alone. It should be done with survivors and family-centered approach, while in partnership with the local civil society, Syrians, and international, and leveraging the international knowledge that we have again. And I think like we also hear about now narratives of, there's priority for, again, crimes against the Assad regime. But in practice, actually, if we look, the major people who committed war crimes in Syria are celebrating in the streets and in the Umayyan. And so they are catching like the few, there's like a lot of performative accountability now in Syria. They're catching, like few ones who like, on a local level committed war crimes, but the actual ones who leveraged and funded and committed war crimes, Hamsho and others, Fadi Saqi and others, are literally roaming around the country celebrating. And so this is another indicator of lack of actual genuine interest in a true accountability process. What could be done? Listen, I mean, that I'm not someone who changed the system from within, right? Personally, but I have friends who've joined the transitional government thinking that this is a way to change the system within. How much you can, I think, to be proven. But if we want to talk like from an advocacy perspective, like from like a strategy perspective, what could be done? I think you got to identify internal allies within the current transitional government in the positions where, and the areas of expertise where they can be, influence these processes, and try to work with them as closely as possible. And I'm talking this like from a very strategy perspective, like advocacy design strategy perspective, not necessarily I would want to do it myself. But if those who feel like they can work with those inside the system, identify internal champions, allies who like could work with us to at least try to influence the existing processes and structure and divert them when possible, etc., to the extent possible. The other thing I want to say here, and maybe I'm like something I'm thinking about, what is my role in Syria going forward and how I want to show up, is the importance of political organizing. I think this is the time for us to start organizing outside of the transitional government and start being politically organized, whether it's the future to form a party or not. They say they want to allow us to create parties. Let's leverage the systems. Let's leverage what the current, laws that allow for any political organizing. And if it doesn't, then I think this is, should be prepared for the future. And so being politically organized, it's something I think we should be focusing on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sana and Joseph. I would love to know if you would like to comment a little bit on that question, but also to elaborate a little bit in 2 minutes. I mean, I'm trying to cover the questions. Also on what specific steps do you think that the government can take or should take to start working on the reconstruction, but also inspired by this transitional justice process, so the linkages with those two topics, if you can cover that.
Yes, thank you, Bay. I think what is key, and it's not particular to Syria, but throughout the world and any kind of society, whether dictatorship or even in a liberal democracy, any kind of achievements when it comes to democratic and socio-economic rights is the result of pressure from below, of various types of struggle from below, and a balance of forces that changes. And even in a liberal democracy, which are less and less liberal, even in Western Europe or in the US, you can see that if there's not a strong resistance from below, or protest movement, counter-fire, most of the ruling strata will put forward more authoritarian dynamics. and I think what we're witnessing in most Western Europe and the US, is this. So first of all, it's about creating a balance of forces in favor of the civil society, but civil society understood in its widest meaning, meaning trade unions, political parties, etc. And I don't believe that, obviously, the background of Tahrir Sham doesn't help, but the key issue is about if it feels enough pressure to do concessions, it will have to do it. But this, it means, protest movement from below. And what I see in Syria, what is quite interesting, if you see this, is that, yes, indeed, as Justin was saying, maybe this government has, until today, some forms of popularity that is mostly based, let's say it, in sectarian dynamics. But when you look at the similar kind of surveys, for the vast majority of Syrian, over 70% to 75%, they see the economic issue as not being at all being tackled by this government. So what we're witnessing is that on one side, you do have not only minorities, but democratic attacks on democratic rights and socioeconomic issues that are not being tackled. And what is needed is basically the meeting of these two things. But this needs political parties that are active, trade unions that are active, not leadership that are appointed from above, etc. So a wider democratic space, to a balance of forces in favor of civil society. And this comes to the reconstruction process. Again, if you want to see the first step, what is clear is a major opening of what kind of reconstruction process we want. So not only the government being involved, but various actors of the civil society. Secondly, a financial program to contribute to the ability of people to come back and to rebuild. This means also, international humanitarian assistance should target key infrastructures, electricity, but also water pumps, water networks, but also the rebuilding of the popular neighborhoods. Until today, if you go to Aleppo, Homs, and other areas of the Damascus rural areas, most of the initiatives of reconstruction are individual or local collective, bringing money from the diaspora, remittances, etc. So also here, you need a collective program. This should be, in my perspective, the first step. But again, this is all linked. Reconstruction or the economy should not be separated from the political path. Otherwise, we will repeat the same mistakes, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph. Just in 2 minutes, exactly in 2 minutes. I know, but it's difficult to answer. But when you visited Syria, also you met Syrians. So, I mean, how do you see the best ways, or what actions, like literally actions, could be taken by the government in order to maintain the coexistence or reconciliation of these sectarian wounds right now? What the government should do on that regard?
Yeah, it's a steep one. I think I agree with Sana that I don't see a lot of political will in this at the moment. But what can be done is the same thing. It's about justice. And right now, one thing I heard a lot in my trips to Syria over the months was that the last regime had really installed a kind of sectarianism in the country. I don't think that's been dealt with. I don't think that's been, healed, if you will, over the last year. The new government hasn't really taken any sort of steps there. A lot of people I've spoken to, I mean, even when I was there earlier in the year, even a lot of minorities were saying, we hope that this side of things is over and that it's finished, and we're willing to move forward. That responsibility falls on the government. The government is kind of playing itself as it's undeniable this government has religious undertones, right? There have been some missteps, and they've tried to calculate these missteps in terms of like public perception, but it's also allowed and kind of played into this sort of supremacy of the majority. And so I think it falls upon them to engage with local actors, with actors from other communities, and not just religious figureheads, not just ones that were in Idlib at a certain period of time, not just ones that will give legitimacy to their political project the way that they found certain people to do that from different communities. They need to be genuinely good faith interactions. I think that the Syrian people in general are open to this and want this. But I think particularly amongst minority groups, and particularly amongst minority groups that have, been prone to acts of, we can say acts of severe violence or massacres over the last year, that early willingness has, and that early kind of, we can say, skepticism or distrust towards the government has become more intensified. And I think now that trust has been overwhelmingly lost. So it's incumbent upon the government to take control here, to cut out kind of this kind of supremacy of the majority, which let's be honest is present not just in Syria but in a lot of countries. It's definitely present in European countries. It's growingly present around the world, in the United States, amongst other places, right? And it's a dangerous force. So the steps that they need to see is genuine reach out to community leaders in different areas, and not just tokens that will kind of propagate and agree with their governing plan.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Justin. In 1 minute or less, I would love to conclude by asking all of you, what one tangible recommendation or ask do you have for the government in order to move forward in the transitional justice process? So whoever ready, would love to start with you, Sarah, if you have something in mind, or if not, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Sarah. In 1 minute or less, please.
You can, I'll give the floor to my colleagues here. I need time to think about it.
Okay, sure thing.
I mean, I can jump in. Honestly, like considering the amount of demand we've heard, maybe something like very, very simple and concrete. I'd be like, please, transparency and communication around the current efforts around the disappeared. There is no transparency and communication. There's only details. We want details, like we've heard recently that they have been handed files 6 months ago about our beloved ones, pictures and lists. We did not hear about them. They don't know what to do with them. That's fine. Just tell us you received evidence and you're looking into how to deal with it. We need more communication. I think Syrians will give time. Like it's like we've learned to wait. But the issue is like there's literally lack of transparency and communication. So that's like very concrete thing. Maybe a bit more communication and transparency.
Great. Thank you, Sana. Joseph, do you have a recommendation in mind? One tangible recommendation? You are on mute.
Sorry. In addition to transparency, I think the issue of inclusivity include other actors to help you achieve this path, which is again reflecting the more general trend of exclusivity when it comes to various files. In addition to this, I would like also a more important interest into economic crimes. Really, this I think is absolutely crucial when it comes also to social justice.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joseph. Justin, have you got something in mind?
I'm struggling to decide, honestly. I think, I've heard some analysts say that the recent elections were a positive step, but I think, maybe a more democratic process, more democratic elections, something that's a bit more inclusive, that's a little bit more transparent. I think I will go with that.
Thank you, Justin. Sarah, would you like to conclude?
Yeah, it's really hard to pick one thing, but because these massacres, barely are awakened from their aftermath, I think accountability in the form of acknowledgement and actually apologizing, really, because what the government, what the interim government has been doing is either avoiding accountability, their own, accountability, or trying to justify it by calling either a scarecrow or calling someone within, like for example, the Syrian, the Sueda community, like as the reason for these things, as like political stagnation keeps happening. So these are all reasons or kind of justifications, and instead of justifications, I think they should just acknowledge their part in these atrocities, and we need to see real accountability and apologizing for what they did to the Syrian people.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you everyone for your amazing interventions. May, over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Obey, for beautifully moderating the conversation. Thank you, Justin, Sarah, Sana, Joseph, for lending your time and expertise. If there's one thing I'm taking away is that all of us want Syria to succeed. And I think many of us on this call believe that the best way to do so is to be honest, practical, critical, but also kind of coming from a tangible perspective. And I hope our audience walked away with some very clear recommendations on, yes, what's certainly an analysis of what's gone wrong, but also recommendations on what could still be done. We're very much in the course correction phase. And I think everyone here truly comes from that place and wants Syria to succeed because the Syrian people deserve so much better. To our audience, thank you for your questions and comments throughout the conversation. To the team that organized today's event, thank you. Today's discussion is, of course, part of a long-term commitment on TimeUp's behalf to program on Syria as a priority country. In this critical moment, you'll see us continue to do work on the political and economic reimagining of the country, the prospects and path to transformative transitional justice, and the state of Syrians who are displaced around the world, all the while continuing to center Syrian voices and the voices and priorities of those most impacted. We look forward to hosting you again at our events in the new year. Thank you all, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.